Hi, welcome back. In this session, I'd like to continue our conversation from the last one. If you remember in my last session, I talked about the effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how it's playing out in markets, in economies, and in politics. In this session, I'd like to bring together another aspect of the invasion that I think has brought light to bear on a concept that's been hot for the last decade, and that's ESG. Now, I want to be upfront and open about the fact that I'm not a great fan of ESG. As if you've read my writings before, I think it's perhaps the biggest scam pulled on business over the last few decades. It's a feel-good scam. People feel good about doing it. But it's a scam where consultants and measurement services, fund managers are getting rich. But none of the people it claims to help, companies, investors, society, are really being helped by it. Now, it seems harsh, but I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought out some of the weaknesses of ESG. And I think if you're an ESG advocate, an ESG fan, I think you need to take a closer look at what this has brought to the surface. Now, I think this is a moment of reckoning. Anytime you have a concept that's hot, there's a time when that concept gets tested. And like the emperor's new clothes, you discover whether this concept is naked or whether it actually has something to it. So let's step back. Now, when Russian troops walked into Ukraine and markets started to collapse, stock markets, bond markets, commodity markets, this should have been ESG's moment to shine. And here's why. ESG's selling pitch has always been that it's about goodness. That if you listen to their pitch as companies, as investors, you could avoid making mistakes that emanate from bad behavior. Not from bad luck, but from bad behavior. And you could argue that that's true, then following ESG should have at least protected you partially from this crisis. Now, as I look at how ESG advocates have reacted to this crisis, and again, I'm not unbiased, I see the reactions fall into three groups. The first are what I call the revisionists. Who are the ESG revisionists? These are the people who claim that every good thing that has happened through the history of humanity is due to ESG. In other words, if we'd all been following ESG 20 years ago, there would have been no banking crisis in 2008. If we'd all been tracking ESG through the last 20 years, there would be no corporate crisis, there would be no Enron. You can basically go through the list of companies that have collapsed, and if you'd tracked ESG, none of those would have happened. At least that's the pitch. Now, of course, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, there were a few revisionists who were so used. There's almost a knee-jerk reaction that they jumped in and said, "We told you so," even without looking at the facts. So the first reaction was, if you'd followed us, you wouldn't be hurt by this event like the rest of the world is. Well, that's not really true. Because if you look at the facts, here's what you see. First is ESG services completely missed the Russia effect. Now, there are four companies, if you remember, in my last session, I talked about Severstal, Sberbank, Yandex, and Lukoil, all high-profile Russian companies with London listings. And right after February 23rd, 24th, which is when the Russian hostilities began, I went and took at how they were ranked by Sustainalytics, which is an ESG measurement service, and they were all ranked in the top quartile of their sectors. Now, Lukoil might have had a low score because it was an oil company, but it was in the top quartile. Same thing with Yandex and Sberbank and Severstal. So before this happened, they were viewed as good companies, at least in the on the ESG dimensions. Now, I checked back again about 2 days ago on the rankings, and magically they seem to have dropped to the bottom quartile. And it's almost like the institutional memory has been wiped out, and the services that can claim that they saw this coming all through with the benefit of hindsight. In fact, there was a study that came out of the Harvard corporate. It's a small paper that looked at how much ESG services miss Russia by comparing ESG scores, social scores, and human rights scores for companies with Russian activities versus their European peer group. And guess what? On every dimension, companies with Russian activities scored higher. Now, this paper concluded that this showed that ESG did not work. I'm not going to go that far, because maybe they didn't see the Russian. But I think that to claim this you can't claim this as a problem with ESG, but you can't claim this as a benefit either. Now, there's a second thing that you can look at that also shows that ESG wouldn't have protected you, and that is if you think about it. One thing that I read in the early post by ESG advocates was, hey, by following ESG, you wouldn't have invested in oil companies, and look how much money Luke Oil lost. That's not quite fair, because if your argument is ESG would have kept you out of fossil fuel companies and oil companies, it wouldn't have just kept you out of Russian oil companies, but out of all oil companies, right? You think, so what? Of all the sectors that I tracked after the Russian invasion, the sector that did the best was the oil sector. So if I tracked ESG, I'd have been out of fossil fuels and oil, and those are the sectors that did the best. And it's also, if you look at the actual numbers for ESG funds and ESG lenders, they've lost substantial amounts. I mean, a Bloomberg Quint study showed that $8.3 billion invested in Russian equities by ESG funds was wiped out. Now, the only reason that number is not higher is because Russia is only 2% of the global economy. It's got this tiny slice of global financial markets. In other words, the only reason ESG was not hurt more by Russia is because Russia is such a small slice of the global economy. So if ESG advocates are somehow claiming that this is a win, I don't know whether they're looking at the facts, because the facts clearly suggest that this was a loss. Now, of course, what happened after the Russian invasion has given ESG advocates some ammunition. Because it's true, US and European companies have pulled their operations. They've either abandoned their Russian operations or suspended them. And for some ESG advocates, this is an indication that companies are now following a moral code, that their lecturing companies has finally worked. Is it though? And here's why I am skeptical. One is, for many of these companies that are abandoning their Russian business, their Russian operations are a really small slice of their overall operations. And for some of these companies, all of that revenue comes not from what they sell to Russians, but from catering to Russian interactions with the rest of the world. Take Goldman Sachs. I mean, Goldman Sachs obviously had a Moscow office. They had a Russian business, but much of their business came from the interactions between Russians and the rest of the world. That business is gone, whether Goldman Sachs stays in or not. The second is, if you listen to my last session, I talked about how much risk premiums have jumped in Russia and Eastern Europe. In Russia alone, the country risk premium, what you add on to your hurdle rate, has gone from about 2% to 10%. Saying, so what? Even if the profitability of the Russian businesses stays intact after these hostilities, your hurdle rates are going to be much, much higher. In other words, these projects are no longer economically viable. It's amazing how in economics and morality converge. It's so easy to be moral. And finally, not all businesses are abandoning their Russian operations. In fact, those companies that have bigger Russian operations, the restaurant businesses, for instance, McDonald's, they're not abandoning the Russian operations, they're suspending them, which means that they stand ready to come back to Russia if events change. Now, if you still believe that what companies are doing in Russia is an indication that they've changed their ways, they've become more moral, they've developed a conscience, I would suggest a thought experiment here. And I know this thought experiment is going to get me into trouble with some parts of the world. Imagine instead of Russia invading Ukraine, that China had invaded Taiwan. Do you think that what you'd have seen in response would have been what you saw with Russia? Would companies have been so quick to abandon their Chinese operations, which are not 1 or 2% of revenues, but 20, maybe 25 or 30% of revenues? Do you think ESG investment funds would be so quick to sell off their Chinese holdings? We're not talking about a few Russian companies. We're talking about something that might be 20, 25% of your holdings. Do you think BlackRock would be so moral if it was China that was up in play rather than Russia? On a more personal level, I know people have been doing their part to kind of show their solidarity with Ukraine, like giving up Russian vodka, even though it might not be made in Russia. Would you be so willing to give up your products and services that come from China? In fact, if your whole apartment is filled with cheap furniture, almost all of it came from China. So I think that it's an experiment that none of us wants to think about because it's potentially catastrophic. But think about it. So the revisionists, I think, can have their say, but clearly this is not a win by any stretch of the imagination for ESG. Which brings me to the second group. I call these the expansionists. Their response to Russia has been, well, no, we just need to have a bigger definition of ESG, something that incorporates risks like the Russia risk. Really? That's where you want to go? Because if you decide to go with that route, then ESG scores now have to reflect a substantial amount of political assessment. In other words, it's got to be as much business assessment as politics. You're saying, so what, let's do it. Do you really want to go down that road of classifying countries as good or bad? I mean, not everything falls into this black and white. There's lots of shades of gray. So because, ultimately, if you keep expanding ESG to keep incorporating whatever the last crisis taught you, sooner or later, ESG is going to try to measure everything. In my view, if ESG tries to measure everything, it's going to measure nothing. In fact, it was interesting. A couple of weeks into this crisis, two Citigroup analysts suggested that companies making weapons should be considered as good companies as long as they sold them to the right side of the conflict. A few analysts even suggested bringing in fossil fuel companies because now they would replace Russian oil. And when this happened, of course, ESG advocates were dismissive. They said, these guys don't know what they're doing. But I think these analysts are onto something. In fact, I think they're true. They're actually closer to the true nature of ESG, which is it has no form. It's amorphous. It's elastic. Because definitions of goodness are going to vary across people and going to vary across time. So, I would file these articles away because you're going to see these play out in every crisis, where you're going to see things pop up to the surface that used to be bad companies that now are becoming good companies. So the expansionists can try, but I don't think there's much room for expanding ESG to cover the next crisis. Which brings me to the Utopians. Through all of the last 2 years, when the criticism of ESG has finally come to the surface, the Utopians have been completely out of the conversation because they've argued that there's nothing wrong with ESG. I call them the if-only people. They say, if only ESG measurement services did a better job of measuring ESG, if only companies didn't greenwash, if only investment funds picked good companies better, if only, then ESG will work. So if you believe them, all you have to do is wait, and ESG over time is going to perfect itself and everything's going to be okay. Really? Let me push back on every single one of those if-onlys. If your belief is that measurement services, one of the well-established findings right now is the correlation in ESG scores across measurement services is low. That measurement services can't come to a consensus on what price is good. I don't think that's a transient phenomenon because services say, look, as we mature, we're going to get convergence, we're going to agree. Really? I mean, why would you think that would happen? Because I know that that's based on two beliefs, and I think both of them are wrong. The first is that disclosure will somehow make convergence more likely. That is, the SEC and the EU require companies to disclose more. That my experience with disclosures is that you don't get convergence, you get divergence. And the second, and I think this is just as dangerous, is I think the belief that somehow as ESG stays around, we're going to agree on what's good. Now, I don't know what world you live in, but getting consensus on pretty much anything has become impossible. I mean, take a look around you, right? Take a look at politics, take a look at economics. Who agrees on any other than the absolute obvious? And even that is questionable. Getting consensus on anything in society is almost impossible. What makes ESG special? So I don't think measurement services are going to converge, or if they do, it's going to be on a checkbox that means absolutely nothing. The second is, I know a lot of ESG advocates look at greenwashing and they say, this is terrible. We need to stop companies from greenwashing. In fact, they're putting pressure on regulators to stop greenwashing. They act like greenwashing is somehow a bug in the system, when in fact it's a feature of ESG. You know what I believe? I believe ESG is designed to encourage greenwashing. This is exactly what you should expect to see when you make it all about scores and measures. In fact, I'll make a prediction. The more resources that get spent, the more regulation that get passed trying to stop greenwashing, the more sophisticated greenwashing is going to become. And you know who it's going to give an advantage to? Bigger companies, companies with more resources. ESG is already tilted towards bigger companies with more resources. This will make it even worse. And on investing, now, I've always felt that this is the weakest link in the ESG argument, that somehow in steady state, ESG investing is going to earn a higher return than investing without the constraints. How can that be? It just violates common sense. How can a constrained optimal be consistently better than an unconstrained optimal? It's sophistry to argue that. In steady state, if you truly believe that you want to invest in good companies, you have to accept the fact that your returns will be lower than not having that constraint, and you have to be okay with it. Goodness requires some degree of giving up things. And finally, to those people who said, what does it matter? Ultimately, this is about making the world a better place. Are you making the world a better place? I mean, take some of ESG's biggest wins. You remember when Engine 1 put pressure on, Engine 1 is this tiny activist investor, put pressure on Exxon to reduce its carbon footprint. And BlackRock, as always, the lapdog of anything ESG related, jumped onto the bandwagon, and they actually succeeded by making Exxon kind of reduce its carbon footprint. Win, right? In fact, across the world, US and European, let me take the across the world. In US and European fossil fuel companies and oil companies, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on them to reduce their reserves and reduce their carbon footprint. You know what they're doing? They're selling their reserves. Keyword is selling, because somebody's buying, right? You know who's buying those reserves? Private equity investors. Over the last decade, they've invested more than $1 trillion in fossil fuels. You know who's winning? Those private equity investors. In fact, the question you got to ask is, would you rather have those reserves in the hands of Exxon Mobil and British Petroleum, where you can put some pressure on them to develop them responsibly, or would you rather have those reserves in the hands of perhaps the least scrupulous people on the face of the earth? You got your wish. So, but again, ESG has always been about performative stuff, right? Do you look good rather than do good? And boy, are they succeeding in making companies look good at the expense of actually doing good. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that, ESG's failures in Russia are going to drive it out. It's just too much money is being made on it for it to go away. It's going to hang around. But in my experience, ultimately, the weaknesses of these concepts become so evident that you can't hang on to them. So you're saying, what are these poor consultants, measurement services, bankers, investment fund managers going to do? Shed no tears for them, because they're going to come with the next big thing. And I'm going to wear my cynic's hat here and give them some help, right? Because they're feeling sorry for themselves on how they should come up with the next big thing. Here's a 5-step process for you developing your next big thing. First, give it a name. Make it as big and as glorious as you can. In fact, if you can make it an acronym, even better, right? It's got this air of mystery to it. So start with that. Give it a name. Then give it a description that's as broad and diffuse as possible, so people reading it can take it to mean whatever they want. In fact, if you get a chance, throw in the word long-term into the description, and for the good of society. That always helps. Third step, reverse engineer the characteristics that make up. So when you think about the details that go into the description, saying what should I make into what I want this to contain, go back and look at the successes of the past. Look at what successful companies, successful investors shared. Bring that into your descriptions. These are the things the description needs as pluses. And look at the things that went into the biggest failures and make them the things you will not do in this whatever it you've created. So you've reversed engineered. Basically you've created a backstory reflecting what succeeded and failed in the past. Then get the establishment to buy in. And you know what? If you've done your work well on step 3, step 4, you've primed the pump already. And what am I talking about? Well, remember, you've designed a concept that's worked in the past because you fit everything that worked in the past. Now, when case writers write cases, they're going to find amazing cases of success. No, how can they not? When consultants go and sell success stories, they're going to be able to find a dozen success stories. And when they want to give warnings of why you should follow the concept and what will happen to you if you don't, they can give you stories of failures. Academic researchers, when they do their statistical analysis, will find statistical significance in every single one of the characteristics and say, there it works. Investment fund managers will unearth magical alphas on backtesting their portfolios. How can they not? I mean, these concepts are almost designed to look good when you first study them because they've been created by looking at what's worked in the past. And final step, if anybody pushes back, and at some point people will start to push back, a couple of things you need to do. First is attribute these things to growing pains. We're a young concept, we're still developing, things will always get better. Since you were careful not to give clear and or even discernible targets, nobody can hold you accountable because there's nothing you need to reach. You can always move the goalposts. And finally, use the goodness shield. Now, what I mean by that is if anybody critiques you, talk about how you're making the world a better place. It'll make the critics look small-minded and mercenary, and you look good. So as the next big things come about, you think, what's that next big thing going to be? I'll make, at the risk of opening up a fresh front of warfare, I'll give you the word that I see a lot of ESG people using, almost readying it to be the substitute for ESG. It's sustainability. What a glorious sounding word. I'm not even sure what it means. In its most benign form, I guess it means long term. Hey, who can argue that companies need to think long term? So you need a sustainability officer to remind you to think long term. That's like having a priest every Sunday reminding you to follow the good path, right? What's wrong with that? The only benefit of replacing one word or one set of words with another word is, you now get to state the obvious. Then you claim the outrageous and you charge the absurd. This is the history of business consulting. In its most malignant form, though, sustainability has become a way in which companies can try to live forever. And you know my views on that. Companies are not meant to live forever. They have a life cycle. And if you keep them alive beyond their, in a sense, their expiration date, they become zombie companies, walking dead companies, sucking up resources, dragging us all into the abyss. I've done a session where I put all three of these big words. I start with stakeholder wealth, I've moved on to ESG, and then I call them my theocratic trifecta. Theocratic because there's almost a religious fervor behind them. But be ready because sustainability is the next big word coming, and you're going to see a lot of selling happening around it with much of what you saw in ESG kind of play out again. So what does this mean for you if you're in the ESG space? When I first started writing about ESG, I thought it was a flawed concept and that if we refined it, did better, it'll improve over time. The more I've hung around people who try to defend ESG, the more I realize how it's been taken over by the McKinseys and the BlackRocks, the consulting firms, the bankers of the world. The more I'm convinced that this is a space where ultimately there's room for only two types of people. The first are what I call useful idiots, well-meaning people who believe they're making a work, and they're the bulk of the people in this space. They're the ones who toil they're the ones who make the trains run on time. They're working at ESG measurement services, ESG arms of consulting firms. They're thinking they're fighting the good fight. And then there are, of course, the feckless knaves. These are the people who should know better, who know that this concept at its center has nothing to it. It's a void. But see it as an opportunity to make money. So you get to pick. Would you rather be a useful idiot or a feckless knave? Or you prefer a different analogy? Would you rather be making the Kool-Aid or drinking it? There's no middle ground here. So, take it. I know some of you will not be happy with this session, but it is what I believe. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this session, unless you happen to be an ESG advocate, in which case you probably haven't. I am sorry. Take care.